Hey folks, I'm back with another Dojo game analysis from Patreon, and today's game is from Dan, who submitted a classical game. And this game comes with a couple notes, so I'll quickly read them. Dan writes, and Dan is playing white here, when my book ran out, I didn't know what to do with my pieces, drifted into a bad endgame, which apparently wasn't quite as bad as I thought, and managed to defend reasonably accurately. Big questions: where should my pieces go in the middle game? What's up with Stockfish's hatred of 18f6, and should I have been less scared in the endgame? So yeah, good questions, Dan. I really appreciate actually submitting the annotations with some specific questions so I can know exactly what you were struggling with. And this is actually a pretty interesting game that comes out of the knight d2 French Tarrasch, which is a really interesting opening. I used to play the French myself for many years, and I always struggled against this one. And in this game, we see black using this trendy move c5, which back when I was playing was just starting to kind of take over as the main move. Back then, knight f6 here was kind of considered the main line, and this was the move most players played because it's like such a typical French move. You put pressure on the e4 pawn, you compel the pawn to move forward, and then black gets kind of like typical play against white's center. And I think this is still a pretty reasonable way for black to handle these positions, but if you look at the highest levels, it's pretty much exclusively c5 being chosen here. So I think with engines, people have kind of analyzed these positions out to basically equality, and I've always felt like the structures that black gets here are a little bit more solid than the structures that black gets in these lines. Like a lot of times in these positions, black ends up playing f6, white takes on f6, and then when black recaptures this e6 pawn, ends up being kind of a backwards pawn and ends up being pretty weak. So c5, I think, is being played for objective reasons. You know, the computer is really optimistic about this move, but I think also for structural reasons, it feels like black's positions end up being a little bit safer. That said, there's a lot of really interesting battleground now in these positions that we can definitely discuss a bit for this game. So white played knight f3. This is definitely a normal move. C takes d4, and here white actually has a pretty big decision. In the game, white played e takes d5, which I think is one of the main options. The other option is to go knight takes d4, which you can definitely explore. And what often happens here is black will play knight c6, white plays bishop b5, bishop d7, and then white takes on c6 and drops back bishop d3. And then you get this kind of structure where white has, I think, a little bit more of an active position. Black, of course, has better control over the center, but white has been, I think, doing reasonably well with setups here, like with queen e2, castling, sometimes pushing e5 and knight f3, or c4 and b3 and putting the bishop on b2. I think objectively the positions are supposed to be holdable for black, but this seems to be where players are kind of still discussing theory in this line. And I think it's a pretty dynamic structure, so definitely good chances for white to get kind of more of a complicated game. Because what we get in the main game, I think, ends up simplifying a little bit too quickly, and it's tough for white to really fight for much of an advantage. So the game, white goes e takes d5, and black takes with the queen. And the drawback of this one is that you lose a little bit of time because the queen gets kicked around. But what black has kind of figured out here is that by the time white actually plays knight b3 and like takes back on d4 and wins the pawn back, black is able to kind of get their pieces out, and then long term the structure is very comfortable for black. So queen d6 is played. I think queen d7 is also a big move here, but pretty much leads to similar positions where white is trying to win this one back. Here black played queen to d6, castles, knight f6, white plays knight b3, white's going to win the pawn back. I think e5 doesn't really work out usually because there's like rook e1 and then both pawns end up hanging, so black doesn't really try to hold on to the pawn at all. And once white wins back the pawn on d4, we usually get to this position. And yeah, knight takes d4 is definitely the most common move here. Now in the game we're going to see queen takes d4, but yeah, knight takes d4 is the main move, I think, pretty much because the endgame is not considered to be so dangerous for black. The structure is pretty healthy, and as long as black is able to just develop his pieces and get everything going, should more or less be fine. So we'll talk about this endgame when we get to the game. I do want to talk a little bit about this position, because if Dan is going to repeat this line, then probably would like to play knight takes d4 here. And yeah, nowadays this one is kind of like a big middle game battleground for, I think, this entire line. There's like tons of games here and lots of theory. And White has tried many different setups with like rook to e1 and c3 and queen e2 and bringing the bishop back to d3 and b3. And so there's many different ideas that you can try. Stylistically, it's similar to like an open Sicilian, where White is trying to use their lead in development, and long-term Black structure is a little bit better. Like Black will be trying to play like a6, b5, getting the bishop to the long diagonal. The queen sits nicely on c7, bishop comes out to d6, and if Black can get both rooks to the center and everything gets developed nicely, then a lot of times Black just solves all their problems just fine. So White has to play for a little bit of an initiative here, and it seems like some of the main lines are, for example, a lot of times Black starts with a6. This is how I used to play this position, just covering the b5 square and then planning queen c7 and bishop d6. And nowadays it seems like the main setup that White is using here is rook e1, queen c7, and bishop to f1, so bringing the bishop back here. And then there's some sharp theory you can investigate, starting with like bishop d6, knight f5, and White sacrifices the h2 pawn, but tries to get some counterplay on g7. You really have to look into the theory yourself if you want to kind of get a deeper look at this one. But yeah, this is just kind of where the sharp stuff is happening. Of course, there's different ways to play it, and there's lots of like quieter ways White can handle these positions. Like you can consider h3 or g3 here. But yeah, knight f5 is now this like super sharp theoretical line. So this is definitely something worth considering to explore further, or going back to this position, rather than going e takes d5, you can also consider playing this one. I would say this line has less theory and is more about kind of understanding what you want from the structure, how you want to develop your initiative further. So I would say this is definitely like the less theoretical option of the two. This is the one where you're just trying to fight for like a long-term structural advantage. But okay, going back to the game, so we end up getting this kind of typical French endgame. Queen takes d4, knight takes d4. And yeah, Black quickly goes bishop d7 here. And basically, if Black can just get everything developed, then Black structure is really solid and Black should have pretty much no problems. So here Dan writes that he looked at a lot of different things and yeah, wasn't sure what to do. Eventually just plays bishop g5 here, which looks like a very natural developing move. And among the options, Dan noted that bishop e2 is interesting, but I doubt I would ever play it when I still have other pieces to develop. And yeah, actually this move I would just wanted to highlight is kind of a thematic idea in precisely the structure, because White's bishop on c4 doesn't really do a whole lot staring at this pawn chain, but can have a clear target on b7 by sitting on f3. So this bishop e2 is actually kind of a interesting way to reroute the bishop in similar endgames. But the really interesting thing about this move, bishop e2, is that it actually reminds me of this game that Magnus won a couple years ago against Nigel Short in a high-level game. I think it was the London Classic, where he basically gets the same exact structure through a different move order. In fact, that game was a 3d takes e4 French, but they end up getting a very similar endgame, and Magnus uses pretty much the same idea. So that game went castles, knight e5, c5. Here White takes, Black trades queens, rook takes d1, bishop takes c5. Very similar position, and here Magnus goes bishop to e2. And then he reroutes the bishop on f3, and then this bishop ends up putting a lot of pressure against Black's queenside for pretty much the whole game. So that might be kind of an interesting model game to look up after this to kind of study in more detail. That was Carlsen against Short from London 2010. Really, really well played endgame by Magnus. So yeah, this move bishop e2 can be considered in similar endgames and like similar structures. But here we get bishop to g5. Black goes rook c8, bishop b3, bishop c5, rook a1, and h6. And very good move. I think black actually handles this part of the game really, really well, and kind of shows the problem with bishop to g5 here is that white doesn't really want to take on f6 and give up the dark square bishop. Then I think black is actually going to be better here because the king is going to be super safe in the center, and then black gets the open g file and now has the two bishops and is definitely doing pretty well. And white doesn't really want to drop back with the bishop because then it kind of gives black this move h6 for free. So white ends up playing bishop h4, but now black goes g5, bishop g3, and knight e4. And yeah, actually very, very strong plan because black is getting ready to just take the bishop on g3 and again take the two bishops. Now white could play bishop e5 here, induce this move f6, and then drop back with the bishop on g3. I think this was worth doing. Dan writes that the Stockfish really approves of this one. And yeah, and then actually later in the game we see black play f6 on their own. And basically this move I think is disliked by the engine simply because it just weakens the e6 pawn, as we'll see in the game. So from white's point of view, yeah, I guess definitely worth doing this one. So let's see what happened. White played knight f3, black took on g3, hg, and now f6. And yeah, f6 I think fairly weakening move, although white needed to find exactly how to take advantage and put pressure here. And actually Dan I think ends up doing a pretty reasonable job and ends up getting a nice counterplay. The engine really likes the idea knight d2 here, I found, and then the plan is to bring the knight to e4 and basically just putting a lot of pressure against black's position because now f6 is weak and d6 is weak, and yeah, it's hard for black to cover all these squares. Of course, the e6 pawn is also weak with rook fe1 coming. So what black should have done is just play king to e7 and just kind of slowly improve the position without giving white any clear targets. Probably black was hoping to stop knight to e5, but I don't think this move is super dangerous. Black has bishop b5, for example, can also bring the rook to d8 at some point, can play bishop e8, and there's not much follow-up with the knight. White simply doesn't have a ton of good targets here. So yeah, f6 ends up weakening black just enough for white to get kind of equal play with his pieces, and kind of liked how white continued here, finding this plan of knight d4 using the pin, and then bringing the knight back to c2, and now to e3. And here white is just showing that he's going to be fighting on the light squares. And this is exactly how you kind of try to neutralize the two bishops. In general, you play on the color of your own bishop. Here white has the light square bishop, so white is playing on the light squares, as white has a lot of pieces that can fight for these squares. Black ends up trading on e3, and from here I would say Dan defends very, very solidly. I didn't really see any huge chances that black could play here. We end up getting slightly worse in this bishop endgame, but it does end up to be holdable, and white ends up holding it. Not sure I really love the exchange here on f4 as happens in the game, because it gives black the e5 square, but I don't think objectively black actually had a way to break through here. So definitely ends up good enough. So yeah, the game was drawn from here and well defended by white. So hopefully you found the opening and middle game talk useful. And if you guys are enjoying this series, please make sure to leave a comment down below. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please make sure to do so. We really do appreciate it. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.